I wanted to show you my anniversary present. It's a Smith & Wesson Model 19-3. As far as I can tell, it was manufactured in 1987. This one is in really good condition. The bluing is really good. It just has a slight amount of holster wear up top. But the bluing otherwise is really good. The lockup's really good. There's really no major defects. And I haven't shot it yet, but I've checked it over, cleaned it really well. And I want to compare it really briefly with another gun that I've shown you, which is my Dan Wesson 44. I believe this one was made in 1985 or 1983. It was a mid-80s gun. Both of these are mid-80s guns. I want to show you because they look very similar, and there's a lot of things that are very similar to them. Now, the Dan Wesson, I'll get this out of the way first. Dan Wesson, I paid $500 for about a year ago, almost a year ago. And it's been quite a shooter, quite a pretty gun. Oh man, it's killing me, those little tiny rust spots. Alright, sorry for the interruption. One of the things about blued guns that's kind of frustrating is that they have a tendency to develop a patina of rust. And so they have to be taken care of really well. And unfortunately, all of these blued ones have had at least a few little specks of rust on them. As far as I know, they didn't develop this while I've had them. They've developed this before I obtained them in very, very tiny amounts. But even still, when you have a polished metal blued finish like this, any kind of defect is very obvious. So, anyways, the Dan Wessons, the history of the Dan Wessons is that Dan was a relative of the Smith & Wesson family. He took what he learned from working at the Smith & Wesson family factory and started his own company making products that, in my opinion, are superior to the Smith & Wesson products in that the revolvers are designed, they're not as pretty, they're not as attractive, but they have a lot of innovative features. I mean, for one, the frames are much stronger than the Smith & Wesson frames, so they can handle hotter loads than the Smith & Wessons can. The barrels use a bushing tensioning system, which gave them a reputation for accuracy in the silhouette shooting world. And they had interchangeable shrouds, so you could take a 3-inch snubby revolver and turn it into a 10-inch hunting revolver with nothing more than the change of the barrel and the shroud. The lockup is very good. The triggers are, in my opinion, on par with the Smith & Wesson triggers. They're there's very little creep in single action. The poundage is very low. The double action, is longer, creepier, obviously, because it's a double action. But they're also pretty smooth. So that's what I'm going to compare it with. This Dan Wesson is in 44 Magnum. The Smith & Wesson is 357 Magnum. I will say right off the bat that the Smith & Wesson, obviously is a smaller, lighter gun, but for sure it doesn't feel like a big clunking gun in your hand. The Dan Wessons, it's got this big chunk of steel up under the barrel and up in the frame. It feels like a big hunking chunk of steel when you're shooting it and when you're holding it. And that can lend itself to some accuracy. It definitely lends to reducing recoil. The Smith, however, the grips are super tight and it feels very solid in the hand. Especially these grips. These Smith grips are ergo wood grips, and they are fabulous grips. Like I said, the Smiths are not quite as strong as the Dans. The Dans also use a ball bearing to put tension on the cylinder so they don't develop end shake and timing problems like the Smiths and the Colts do. But those are really minor things if you don't shoot them a ton. So just a quick comparison. These are aftermarket wood grips from Hogue, so don't pay attention much to the grips. But the bluing, pretty equal quality. The Dan Wesson bluing looks more black. The Smith & Wesson bluing looks slightly more blue. It might just be a feature of the curves on the Smith that makes it look like that, or look that way. The scalping on the cylinder, the Dans kind of have more of a pointed shape than the Smiths do. Just an aesthetic thing, not really that big of a deal. Both, I mean, the Dans use a pretty plain Jane hammer and trigger. The Smith, this in particular Smith, has it looks like case hardening. It's really attractive on the hammer and on the trigger. The sights, the front blade, the rear blades are very similar. The crane design is pretty similar. This one has a crane that can be screwed on and off, I believe, just like the Dan does. So let's talk about the triggers a bit. Both of these triggers, the single action pull is much higher than 8 pounds. I estimate that the one on the Smith & Wesson is about 10 pounds, and the one on the Dan Wesson is probably about 14 pounds. So they're very heavy triggers for single action. Double action, however, let me hold this, avoid touching the bluing so much. Here's my trigger pull gauge. It reads 3.5 pounds, and it reads 3.5 pounds. 3.5 pound trigger pull is pretty light, a lot lighter than even some of the target type rifles are, and it has no creep in single action. So it's a matter of putting weight on it. You put 3.5 pounds of weight on it, and the trigger lets go. In comparison to Dan, the trigger and the Dan is much further back feeling. And the Dan, also, you don't actually realize the Dan, it doesn't feel like the Dan, the Dan's trigger is definitely lighter, and you don't really realize you're pulling on it so much by the time the hammer drops. And that means that it can be, yep, there you go, 2 3/4 pound. So that's about just over ½ pound difference. That was 3 pounds. So about ½ pounds, maybe a ½ pound difference. But I will say that the Smith & Wesson, you definitely feel like you have your finger on the trigger, and I think that the combination of the lighter trigger and the angle of the trigger and the fact that the trigger is further back, when you put weight on the Dan Wesson trigger, it definitely takes you by surprise easier than the Smith & Wesson trigger does. And in my opinion, that lends itself to some accuracy. So, some other brief things. Smith & Wesson Model 19, fabulous, gorgeous gun. My wife picked this up for me for, I believe, about $600. The Dan Wesson here, 44 Magnum, I bought for $500, but I got a steal of a price on it. Normally they're about $7-ish or $800 in that ballpark. If you have $600 to spend, and you have a gun shop that's willing to price things reasonably, I would say it's better to buy a nice condition mid-80s Model 19 with a good trigger than to buy a new firearm or a new revolver like a Ruger GP100. And the reason is, the older Smiths, or the Smiths in the correct time range, have triggers comparable to what you might find out of a custom shop. Great, fabulous triggers, and you won't find that on a Ruger GP100 or a modern Smith unless you get one from the custom shop. So that's my advice. Great gun. I love my wife for getting it for me. If you see one in a shop and it's priced reasonably, definitely get it and you won't regret it.